This lecture is on an introduction to the rise of Europe. So we ended kind of talking about this period up to Charlemagne and the Vikings, right, when we last talked about Europe. And we're now going to kind of move into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And what ends up happening is people kind of take the period from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, about the 5th century, 476, if you want to be exact. They take that period until like the 15th century and the Renaissance and say, yeah, everything was really terrible about that. That was during that time, that was the Middle Ages. Those people were kind of dumb and ignorant and superstitious. And I think this is very problematic for reasons I'll talk about. But I think it's interesting when sometimes if I look at popular culture, that's how the Middle Ages are presented, as this time of just kind of ignorance, superstition, everyone's filthy, things are terrible. But we have an issue here. If the people in the Middle Ages were just so ignorant and, superstitious and what have you, why would it be Europe that links together the old world and the new world? Right? Why is it that? Why is it that the Europeans, despite being behind, right? They're going to be behind Islamic civilization, Indian civilization, Chinese civilization in many ways. And so that's why there is some truth to the stereotype of Europe being poorer and not as hygienic and so forth as these other places. They were poorer. Things were dirtier. If you don't have money, it's harder to keep clean, right? But the Europeans had to be doing something right if they're going to be the ones that link together the new and old worlds, right? Other civilizations perhaps had the capability to do so, but it's the Europeans who do it. And we have to kind of set the stage for why that will happen eventually. And I think it goes way back. And to give you a sense of what I mean about this kind of stereotype and how it's problematic, we can kind of look at this. And this is a slide I just found on the internet. And this is a common way people divide history: ancient history, medieval history. Those Middle Ages or Dark Ages, as if they're the same thing. They're not, but okay. Sorry, I get a little annoyed during this lecture. And then modern history. And the idea is the ancient history was great, right? Ancient thinkers try to figure out the world, great accomplishments in art, math, philosophy. Awesome. And then in medieval history, life in Europe is difficult and dangerous. Few people are educated and little advancement in learning takes place. Christian church is all powerful and people look to it to lead them to a happy eternity. So, kind of a polite way. People are superstitious. Things are really terrible, and so forth. But here's some things that are wrong. Life in Europe is difficult and dangerous. It wasn't during this period either. I would say it was very difficult and dangerous for the large numbers of slaves in the Roman Empire. They certainly found life difficult and dangerous. Gladiators did. Christians being persecuted found life difficult and dangerous, right? It's not that simple, right? And the error they do is they focus on the elites, the great philosophers and thinkers during this time period, but don't consider the poor slaves. But here they focus on the poor serfs. And it's like, well, wait a second. And here we go. Few people are educated and little advancement and learning takes place. Well, there is some truth to that. And a lot of times stereotypes do have a little bit of truth, but that's not entirely correct. I kept emphasizing how kings, especially working with the church, tried to improve education. Right? So it is true that there's little people are educated, but they're looking at this in a very negative way, right? I look at it as trying to recover, as people who are facing lots of difficulties are trying to pull themselves out of the difficult situation. This is just kind of like, well, there's little education. Doesn't explain why. But it's kind of implied it's because of the church, right? The church kind of distracts us from this world. But again, I showed the church is helping to restore education. So let's move on. Renaissance scholars rediscovered knowledge of the ancient and create amazing art, architecture, literature, etc. Christian church is still very powerful. They're still there. But Renaissance scholars rediscovered knowledge of the ancients. Well, we talked about how people, and we'll talk about in the upcoming sections, how Europeans were doing that too. In this time period, in the Middle Ages, were trying to keep alive as much as they could the light of classical learning. So it is true that the Renaissance will emphasize that more, but as we'll see, Europeans in the Middle Ages were doing it too. It's just they were wealthier in this time period, right? and that allowed them to do more. So here's the problem. This is trying to say there's a clean break, like that there's this like dividing period. Things are bad here, things are great here. These people are ignorant, these people are not interested in learning, while these people are. But that's not correct. This idea of clean breaks are not correct. In history, usually you have development. So it's not like, oh, these people were uneducated and ignorant. These people, they're getting educated and they actually want to learn stuff. No, there's development. In this time period, as we'll see, people were interested in learning, but their economy wasn't as developed. It's hard to build schools and educate people when the economy is not well developed. But the economy will continue to develop during this time period, and they start immediately investing the money that the economy is producing in universities and schools. And so the economic developments that happen during this time period allow for all this wonderful stuff. And this interest in knowledge of the ancients, it was here too. It's just now they've got more money during the Renaissance to look into it. So what I want us to understand then is what's going on in the Middle Ages, or the so-called Dark Ages, is key to European power later on, and is key to why it's Europeans who are going to connect the world. So rather than looking at the Dark Ages or Middle Ages, medieval history as a really terrible period, it's important to note that it is true that there were people's lives did get more difficult in many ways compared to the ancient world. I gave you an example of roof tiles, you may remember. But it's incorrect to see everything as negative and to miss out that the people then were trying to understand what was going on. And we're going to be talking about that. So what we're going to do in the next few lectures is we're going to have a thematic examination of 3 developments between 1000 and 1550 that help set the stage for European power. What do I mean by thematic examination? We're not going to go straight through chronologically. Instead, we're going to look at 3 developments that I would argue help set the stage for Europeans to be the ones to rise to power eventually, and to be the ones that will go out and explore and tie together the so-called old and new worlds. Or to put another way, they're going to be the ones that link together Asia, Africa, and Europe with North and South America. The first development we're going to look at is competition and conflict in Europe. How that is going to help set the stage for the period of exploration and for later European power. That may seem really weird, how war could be, in a sense, lead to this kind of development, but it will. We'll talk more about that, though, when we get to it. We will also talk about how growing political and economic freedom in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance is going to help make for a stronger Europe and eventual exploration. And finally, we're going to talk about how an appreciation for reason and a thirst for knowledge, a thirst you could even say for wisdom, is going to drive Europeans to be open to the outside world, and when they can, to go out and explore that world. So again, my key point here is for us to understand how there is a continuity between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and how people are going to start, how Europeans, because of these developments that have their roots, maybe you could say in the ancient world, but continue through the Middle Ages, kind of come into bloom in the Renaissance, is going to lead them to be the ones that link together the old and new worlds and to eventually become very powerful.